whether man-made or not, one of the worst disasters in human history. And we are genuinely less prepared for the next one than the last one.
It's not one of the worst disasters in human history. I could name 100 worse ones.
Fair enough,
Okay.
but it was bad. I didn't enjoy it.
Let's not be purple.
It was a bad.
Bill Maher recently hosted journalist Ezra Klein on his show, Real Time with Bill Maher, and engaged in a compelling debate that captivated the live studio audience. During their discussion, Klein introduced several progressive viewpoints, prompting Maher to challenge him directly, offering his own perspective in response. It has been interesting to witness Maher's evolving stance on certain political and cultural issues. Over time, he has become more vocal in addressing viewpoints he finds overly ideological, using his platform to push back against what he perceives as excessive political correctness. His ability to challenge guests while maintaining a thoughtful discourse has become a defining feature of both Real Time with Bill Maher and his podcast. This exchange is a prime example of Maher engaging in direct and candid discussion, not only debating his guest, but also providing insight for his audience. Many longtime viewers have observed his shift in approach, particularly in recent years, as he emphasizes pragmatic viewpoints over ideological extremes. Now let's take a look at the segment where Bill Maher critically examines Ezra Klein's arguments live on Real Time with Bill Maher.
The host of the Ezra Klein Show podcast and the co-author of the book Abundance, Ezra Klein, and he writes the weekly Dish newsletter and hosts the podcast The Dishcast with Andrew Sullivan. Andrew Sullivan. Okay, here are the questions. Andrew, what do you think of news that British intelligence knew COVID was a lab leak in 2020 and officially ignored their report?
Not just knew, aided a 95% certainty. Same with the German intelligence service. March 2020. There's a new book out called COVID's Wake. I was reading it this last couple of weeks, and the core paper that killed off any idea that this was a lab leak in China, the proximal origin paper, which was produced with Fauci and Collins of the NIH and NIAID helping it along, was a lie, a conscious lie. That the people who looked at it, we now have their emails, are saying in the very first days of looking at the virus, this looks very man-made to us. This is so friggin' obvious this is man-made. Well, so friggin' obvious, one of them said. And then they wrote the report saying there is no evidence that this was made in a lab. The question is why? Why would they lie to us about that? And they did.
Well, I can give you one answer, the New York Times. The New York Times said any questioning of this being from a lab was racist, which always struck me as odd because it seems much more racist to go, wow, these people are eating bats?
I know.
I mean, it's just one example, but a good example of why people lost faith in the left, because they do stupid things like that. Not to be an I told you so, but from the very beginning I was saying this shouldn't even be political, but it's at least a 50-50 it came from the lab, and that in 50 years, I can't imagine people going, wait, you mean in 2020, there was this thing that escaped from a lab in Wuhan, that started in Wuhan, and there was a lab in Wuhan that was studying it? And they didn't think that was connected? And they blamed it on bats? Really? It just doesn't make any sense.
It makes a little bit more sense.
You can gaslight people so easily.
Yes.
The concerning aspect is that during this period, while Bill Maher may not have been as outspoken, many of us were already expressing these views. At that time, nearly half the country dismissed such opinions as extreme or irrational. Even now, approximately 15 to 20% of people might still reject these arguments, despite growing acceptance of what Maher is now stating. Back then, a significant portion of the population refused to acknowledge this perspective, labeling it as misinformation. However, many of those individuals have since recognized the validity of these points. That said, there remains a segment of the population that continues to deny the possibility, adamantly insisting, no, that's not true, it didn't originate from a lab. They hold this belief firmly, which is what makes this situation particularly concerning. What's truly unsettling is the large number of people who remain unwilling to acknowledge fundamental realities. This is the real challenge. While figures like Bill Maher are open to reassessing their views and adapting to new information, there are countless others who refuse to do so. Instead, they remain entrenched in their ideological bubbles, unwilling to step outside their echo chambers or reconsider their stance.
Democrats are so much as fault as scientists who went along with this, knowing better. It's their integrity I'm concerned about, to actually lie and distort what they could see with their own eyes because they were afraid of politics. The other question is this. This lab was a gain of function lab. That means they were creating viruses, dangerous viruses, to figure out how to protect you from them. This gain of function research was always dangerous. Everyone knew it was dangerous. A long time ago, you go back to 2015, you will find a big meeting in London where they say there's one lab in the world most likely to have a problem with this, Wuhan. Do you know who was the biggest supporter of gain of function research for the last 30 years? Anthony Fauci. Anthony Fauci. Now, remember that name. There's a reason he was given a pardon back to 2014. There is something very wrong going on here.
You know? Yeah, I also don't think he did it for nefarious reasons. There's an argument to be made. There's an actual intellectual debate to be had. Should gain-of-function research be done? We want to get ahead of viruses. The other answer is, the other response would be, it's too dangerous. Because if it gets out, it's going to be bad. And that's what happened. But I don't think he's an evil guy, like some people do, who was trying to get rich off this.
No.
Okay, he just made the wrong call.
No, he knew from the get-go that the Wuhan lab had security levels that were the average of a dentist's office. They should have been at the highest level imaginable. He knew that. Not only that,
he made the wrong call.
The NIH and NID had helped fund it.
Right.
If we assume the most charitable perspective, making the wrong call in this situation would be an example of extreme incompetence. This isn't a case of carefully weighing options in a 50-50 scenario and simply making a bad judgment call. That's not what happened here. As noted, the security protocols at the lab were severely lacking, especially given the high-risk nature of gain-of-function research. Such research should require the highest levels of security, strict cleanliness, and absolute precaution to prevent any potential leaks. If Dr. Fauci dismissed concerns and deemed the situation acceptable, that wouldn't just be a miscalculation, it would be a clear case of gross negligence. At best, it reflects a severe lack of oversight. Personally, I believe it goes beyond incompetence, but ultimately it's up to you to draw your own conclusions.
So you don't want to go down in history as the person who helped develop the virus that killed millions of people. You want to go down as the one who saved millions of people. That was at stake, a reputational matter.
A piece of a lot of this, it seems insane to me, is we are now years after, whether man-made or not, one of the worst disasters in human history. And we are genuinely less prepared for the next one than the last one.
It's not one of the worst disasters in human history. I could name 100 worse ones.
Fair enough, but it was bad. I didn't enjoy it.
Let's not be purple.
It was a bad pandemic. Let's put it that way.
A lot worse.
Or the aspect that will be remembered most negatively in human history won't be the event itself, but rather the response to it. The lasting impact will come from the lockdowns and the enforcement of mandates, particularly vaccine mandates. That's what will be viewed as one of the most controversial and consequential aspects, not necessarily the initial event. It's important to make that distinction clear.
It's genuinely not my point on this. I'm happy to see that the Holocaust is worse than the pandemic. I think it's fine. But in other things, other countries, in this country, right? After something terrible happens, you often have these big bipartisan commissions that come up with a bunch of recommendations and try to create preparedness for next time. I sort of agree with you that we've gone way too far on airport security for too long, but we did a lot on things like biosecurity that made sense and actually did make us safer.
Yeah.
And we have anti-learned lessons, right? On the one hand, we had amazing success with things.
By the way, do you think airport security has become excessive? Personally, I don't mind it. In fact, I don't feel comfortable in large crowds anymore due to the increasing number of incidents, from violent attacks to just bizarre behavior. When I'm in a crowded place, I want strong security measures in place. If weapons aren't allowed somewhere, I want to be sure that no one else has one either. That's why I think airport security is necessary. Metal detectors for everyone. Makes sense. Honestly, I'd even support having metal detectors in places like movie theaters. I have nothing to hide, and if you don't either, then why not prioritize safety? Security should be a priority in any densely populated area because, unfortunately, people can be unpredictable. We've seen some truly bizarre and reckless behavior, and I'd rather be in an environment where safety is taken seriously.
Operation Warp Speed, and now you got RFK Jr. running HHS. On the other hand, a bunch of huge mistakes were made on things like lockdowns, and we're just arguing about them. We haven't put out, say, a new best practices, right? Gain of function research, which y'all were just talking about, it is just an argument. It's something I try to keep paying attention to, and they haven't come out with strong new guidelines. Bird flu, everybody I read who knows what they're talking about says we are in a terrible position on bird flu if it actually begins to mutate and make the jump. We just have never figured out a way to find a policy equilibrium here, as opposed to sort of keep rehaving the argument. The arguments are important.
Because everything gets politicized.
But everything gets politicized. But we don't have the capacity to come to agreements. It's really bad that we are this unprepared now.
But that's why the integrity of science is so important.
I agree with you on that.
If we don't trust the scientists, who on earth are we going to trust?
That's completely true. The pharmaceutical industry, along with the broader scientific community, has created an atmosphere of distrust. While the handling of lockdowns certainly played a role, my biggest concern is how experts who challenged the mainstream narrative were treated. Highly qualified scientists, those with the credentials to weigh in on these discussions, were often silenced if their views contradicted the dominant perspective. Instead of engaging in open debate, these individuals were banned or ostracized from the scientific community. That's what truly eroded my trust. If someone genuinely believes in the validity of their argument, they should be able to defend it with evidence and logic rather than resorting to censorship. When one side actively suppresses opposing viewpoints, it raises serious questions about their credibility. This is why I now approach scientific and governmental claims with skepticism, which is a troubling place for any society to be, when its citizens no longer trust the institutions meant to inform and protect them. Let me know in the comments what you think about Bill Maher challenging Ezra Klein on Real Time with Bill Maher regarding his claims about the events of 2020. Do you agree with Maher's stance or do you see it differently?